"You don't belong here." The words hung in the air like poison. Henry Fletcher's weathered hands trembled slightly as he clutched his worn golf cap. 47 years he had tended these greens, known every blade of grass, every subtle slope. The tournament director's voice carried across the pristine practice area, causing heads to turn. Designer suits and diamond-studded watches suddenly seemed to glitter more brightly against Henry's faded work clothes. A few chuckles rippled through the gathering crowd of elite players. In the corner, partially hidden by the shade of an old oak tree, a man in sunglasses lowered his phone, his attention fully captured by the unfolding scene. The Golden Pines Charity Tournament was the highlight of the social calendar, where tech billionaires and Hollywood elites gathered under the pretense of philanthropy. Henry had arrived early that morning, not to work the grounds as usual, but with his grandfather's restored clubs, his most prized possession. One spot had been reserved for a local qualifier, and at 72, Henry had finally mustered the courage to enter. He'd won fairly, beating men half his age. Now, under the California sun, the tournament director's voice was making it clear that qualification was one thing, belonging was another entirely. The small crowd grew as phones emerged to capture what was quickly becoming a spectacle. "This tournament has standards," the director continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "Perhaps you misunderstood the nature of your qualification." Security was already approaching. Henry's shoulders slumped as a lifetime of dreams began crumbling before him. He'd never asked for special treatment, only a chance to play the course he'd lovingly maintained for decades. The man in sunglasses set his drink down and moved forward through the crowd. Few noticed him at first, but as he removed his glasses, murmurs of recognition spread. Leonardo DiCaprio was about to change everything, and everyone present would remember this day for reasons no one could have anticipated. Henry Fletcher had spent his entire adult life shaping the landscape of Golden Pines. He knew the secrets of the 18th green, how the subtle westward slope could send even a perfectly struck putt drifting 3 inches off line. He understood the way morning dew affected the 7th fairway and how the bunker on 14 played differently after a light rain. This knowledge was etched into his body, his permanently sun-darkened forearms, the calluses that no amount of retirement could erase, the slight curve in his spine from decades of bending to the earth. The old groundskeeper had watched from afar as presidents, celebrities, and titans of industry tested themselves against his creation. He'd quietly corrected their misreadings of the course from behind his maintenance cart, never speaking up, never intruding. The Golden Pines Charity Tournament was in its 15th year, growing more exclusive and more extravagant with each iteration. This year's entry fee was $50,000 per player, more than Henry had made in his best year of employment. But the one community qualifying spot had been his chance, his one opportunity to step from the shadows of maintenance sheds and walk the hallowed grounds as a player. When his name had appeared on the qualifier's leaderboard, some had thought it a joke, but Henry had played the municipal course every Monday, his one day off, for 40 years. The tournament director, Maxwell Reed, had built his career on exclusivity. His events were famous for their impeccable guest lists, flawless execution, and the invisible barriers that separated the elite from everyone else. When he'd seen Henry's name on the qualifier list that morning, his first instinct had been to find a loophole, a technicality to disqualify him. Finding none, he'd resolved to make the situation clear through other means. Public humiliation was a powerful deterrent. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Reed announced loudly, making sure his voice carried to the gathering crowd of celebrities and executives. The qualifying round was for amateur golfers of a certain caliber. His eyes flicked dismissively over Henry's weathered appearance. "Not for the maintenance staff. We appreciate your enthusiasm, but this event requires certain standards of play and presentation." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some laughed outright, nodding in agreement. Others looked away uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the distant trees. A few frowned, but remained silent. The boundaries of belonging were being clearly drawn, and few were willing to step across them. Henry stood still, his gnarled hands gripping his grandfather's driver, his eyes fixed on the ground. Decades of deference had conditioned him not to talk back, not to make a scene, even as his dignity was being stripped away piece by piece. Leonardo DiCaprio had arrived at Golden Pines without fanfare, preferring to blend in before the tournament began. Environmental charities were his passion, and though he enjoyed golf, he valued the networking opportunities these events provided for his foundation work. He'd chosen a secluded spot to practice his swing when the commotion caught his attention. Watching the scene unfold, he felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling that drove his environmental activism, his fight against systemic injustice. The security guards were now flanking Henry, not quite touching him, but making their presence unmistakable. One reached for the old man's golf bag. "Sir, we'll need to escort you to the staff area. Perhaps you can watch the tournament after your shift ends." The guard's tone was professionally detached, but the message was clear. Know your place. Something shifted in Leo's expression as he watched Henry's weathered face. He recognized that look, quiet dignity in the face of humiliation. He'd portrayed characters facing similar moments, had researched and inhabited their emotions. But this wasn't a script. This was happening now, in real time, to a real person. The actor moved through the crowd with purpose, each step deliberate. A few recognized him, whispers of, "Is that DiCaprio?" spreading like ripples. He wasn't thinking about cameras or public perception. Something more fundamental was driving him, a sense that moments like these defined not just the people involved, but everyone who witnessed them and chose to act or remain silent. "Excuse me." Leonardo's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. The security guards hesitated, sensing a shift in the dynamic. Maxwell Reed turned, his practiced smile already forming before recognition dawned. "Mr. DiCaprio, we're honored to have you with us today. I trust you found everything to your satisfaction during practice?" Leonardo ignored the question, stopping beside Henry. "You're Henry Fletcher, right?" he asked, his tone conversational, but carrying enough to be heard by those nearby. The old groundskeeper looked up in surprise, confusion evident on his weathered face. He nodded once, uncertain. "I've heard about you," Leonardo continued, extending his hand. "You're something of a legend among serious golfers. Didn't you qualify with a 67? That's 3 under on a challenging course." Henry's calloused hand met Leonardo's in a brief handshake. "Yes, sir. Been playing that municipal course for 40 years. Never thought I'd get to play here, though." His voice was soft but clear, a lifetime of quiet dignity evident in every word. Maxwell Reed's smile tightened, his eyes darting between the two men and the growing crowd. Phones were emerging from pockets, subtly at first, then more openly as people recognized the actor. This was not the narrative Reed had planned for his prestigious tournament. "Mr. DiCaprio," he interjected smoothly, "perhaps we can discuss this privately. There are certain standards and protocols for our event that—" "Standards?" Leonardo echoed, his tone pleasant but his eyes sharp. "Like qualifying fairly through official channels? Because that's what Mr. Fletcher did, from what I understand." The crowd had grown now, at least 30 onlookers forming a loose semicircle. Among them were CEOs, film producers, and other celebrities, all watching with interest as the dynamic shifted. Social media was already capturing snippets of the exchange. What had started as a quiet humiliation was transforming into something else entirely. Reed's professional smile remained fixed, but his eyes had hardened. "Of course, qualification is important," he said carefully, "but our tournament also considers presentation, equipment standards, and the overall experience for our distinguished guests and sponsors." Leonardo nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Reed's words. Then he turned to Henry's golf bag, an old leather carry bag, well-maintained but decades out of fashion. "Those are beautiful clubs," he said, gesturing to the gleaming club heads visible at the top. "May I?" Henry hesitated, then nodded. Leonardo carefully extracted a worn but immaculately maintained blade putter, its brass head polished to a warm glow. He balanced it in his hands with the appreciation of a true enthusiast. "This is a Wilson 8802, isn't it?" "From the 60s?" Leonardo asked, examining the club with genuine interest. "They don't make them like this anymore." Henry's face transformed, pride momentarily overcoming his discomfort. "My grandfather's. He taught me to play with these. I've restored them myself over the years." The crowd's attention shifted, the narrative changing before their eyes. What had been a moment of exclusion was becoming something else, a shared appreciation for craftsmanship, for tradition, for the true spirit of the game. A tall man in a tailored golf shirt stepped forward from the gathering spectators. "Those are Sam Turner classics, aren't they?" he asked, his Australian accent recognizable to many as Adam Scott, the former Masters champion who was participating in the tournament. "I've only seen a complete set in museums." Before Henry could answer, another voice joined in. "My father played with those," said an older executive, his initial discomfort replaced by nostalgia. "Said you could feel the ball like nothing made today." Leonardo watched as the energy shifted, the shared language of golf enthusiasts temporarily transcending the social barriers that had seemed so impenetrable moments before. Reed stood slightly apart, his authority diminishing as the narrative slipped from his control. "Mr. Fletcher qualified fairly," Leonardo said, his voice carrying easily now that the crowd had quieted. "And from what I understand about golf, it's one of the few sports where players of all backgrounds compete on equal footing, where integrity and skill matter more than anything else." He paused, letting the words settle. "In fact, isn't that what makes this game special?" Eyes turned to Reed, who found himself in an unexpected position. The cameras were rolling, the audience growing, and the stakes suddenly much higher than a simple tournament registration. Reed cleared his throat, professional instincts kicking in as he assessed the shifting situation. "Of course, golf is about skill and integrity," he agreed, attempting to regain control. "However, as tournament director, I must consider all aspects of our exclusive event. Perhaps Mr. Fletcher would be more comfortable as our honored guest rather than a competitor." Leonardo's eyes narrowed slightly. The careful wording wasn't lost on him. Reed was offering a compromise that still denied Henry his rightful place. Before he could respond, Henry himself spoke up, his voice quiet but suddenly steady. "I've walked these grounds for 47 years, he said, his gaze moving across the immaculate fairways he'd tended through countless seasons. "Watched thousands play this course, fixed their divots, repaired their ball marks. All I wanted was one chance to play it myself. I earned that chance." The simplicity of his words hung in the air. Several phones captured the moment, the weathered groundskeeper speaking with quiet dignity against the backdrop of the exclusive club. Leonardo placed a hand lightly on Henry's shoulder. "I'd be honored to be paired with Mr. Fletcher for today's round," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "In fact, I think we could learn a lot from someone who knows this course better than anyone alive." Adam Scott stepped forward again. "Count me in for that group," he said with a smile. "I've been trying to figure out the break on the 12th green for years." The crowd's energy had completely transformed. What had begun as uncomfortable spectators to an exclusionary moment had become witnesses to something more powerful. Several nodded in agreement. Some even applauded. Social media was already spreading the story beyond the confines of Golden Pines. Reed found himself cornered, trapped between the club's exclusionary traditions and the very public challenge to them unfolding before increasingly supportive onlookers. His options were dwindling rapidly. "That's," he began, attempting to formulate a response that wouldn't damage his reputation. "That's certainly an interesting proposition." He forced a thin smile, but his eyes revealed the calculations happening behind it. The situation had escalated beyond his control, with Leonardo DiCaprio, one of the tournament's most prestigious participants and a powerful voice in Hollywood, publicly taking a stand. The security guards exchanged uncertain glances, awaiting direction that wasn't coming. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, the outcome still uncertain, but the stakes now crystal clear. A tense silence hung over the gathering as Reed's face flushed with barely contained frustration. He was a man accustomed to control, to invisible lines of power that were never questioned. Now those lines were blurring before his eyes, and worse, it was happening publicly, with cameras capturing every moment. "While I appreciate the sentiment," Reed finally said, his voice tight, "tournament pairings were finalized last week. We can't simply rearrange them to accommodate—" "I'll switch," came a new voice. A slender man in his 50s stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. Several people recognized him as the CEO of a major tech company. "I was paired with Mr. DiCaprio. Happy to trade places with—" he gestured toward Henry, "with our qualifier here." Reed's mouth opened and closed without sound. The situation was spiraling further from his grasp with each passing second. Behind him, an assistant was frantically whispering into a phone, likely updating club ownership on the developing public relations situation. Leonardo watched this unfold with measured calm, his presence serving as both catalyst and witness. This wasn't performative for him. He'd spent years working on environmental justice, understanding how power protected itself, how systems of exclusion functioned. He recognized this moment for what it was, a small but significant challenge to an unspoken order. "Mr. Reed," Leonardo said, his tone conversational but unyielding, "golf has a troubled history with exclusion. Clubs like this one were designed to keep certain people out." He gestured toward Henry. "This man qualified fairly. He spent his life making this course what it is. What message are we sending if we deny him his earned place?" The crowd had grown deathly quiet, rapt attention focused on this unexpected confrontation. Even those who had initially scoffed at Henry's presence were now watching with uncertain expressions, social calculations being rapidly revised as the power dynamics shifted. Henry himself stood straighter now, his initial shame replaced by a quiet resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He had become, without seeking it, a symbol of something larger, a test of the very values golf claimed to represent: fairness, integrity, respect. Reed's assistant approached hastily, whispering something urgently in his ear. The tournament director's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, from rigid defiance to careful calculation. The whispered conference lasted only seconds, but everyone could see the mental recalibration happening. "It seems," Reed announced, his voice artificially pleasant, "that there has been a misunderstanding. Of course, Mr. Fletcher's qualification stands. We simply had concerns about his comfort level at such a high-profile event." He gestured expansively, a practiced movement designed to appear generous. "If Mr. DiCaprio and others wish to adjust their pairings, we can certainly accommodate that." The attempt at saving face was transparent, but it offered a path forward. Leonardo nodded once, not willing to humiliate Reed further now that the central issue was resolved. "I think that would be appropriate," he said simply. Henry looked between them, decades of learned deference warring with his newfound position. Finally he spoke, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I didn't come here for special treatment. I don't need to play with celebrities." He turned to Leonardo with genuine respect. "Though I appreciate your standing up for me, sir. All I want is what I earned, a chance to play this course I've tended for nearly 50 years. The authenticity of his words resonated through the crowd. This wasn't about celebrity intervention anymore. It was about a man's simple dignity and rightful place. Several people nodded unconsciously, moved by his understated eloquence. Leonardo smiled, genuine admiration in his expression. Fair enough. But I'd still be honored to watch you play this course, maybe pick up some insights. Perhaps we could meet on the back nine. Adam Scott chimed in again. I'd still like to hear about that 12th green break. Reed, sensing the tide turning definitively against him, made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. Well then, it seems we're all in agreement. Mr. Fletcher will play as qualified, and we can proceed with our charity tournament as planned. He clapped his hands together briskly. Shall we move to the opening ceremony? But the crowd wasn't ready to disperse. One by one, players and celebrities approached Henry, introducing themselves, examining his vintage clubs with genuine interest. What had been an attempt at exclusion had transformed into something unexpected, a moment of authentic connection across social divides. The tournament's opening ceremony proceeded with a different energy than in previous years. Reed's carefully scripted remarks about exclusivity and prestige rang hollow now, subtly undermined by the morning's events. Henry stood among the players, still in his modest attire, but no longer out of place. Something fundamental had shifted. As players dispersed to their starting holes, Leonardo approached Henry one last time. Camera phones tracked their interaction from a respectful distance. The contrast between them was striking, the world-famous actor in designer golf attire and the weathered groundskeeper in his simple clothes. Yet, in this moment, they met as equals. "Thank you," Henry said simply, extending his hand. Leonardo shook it firmly. "I didn't do anything you hadn't already done for yourself by qualifying. I just made it harder for them to ignore." Henry nodded, understanding the subtle distinction. Still, not many would have spoken up. "Maybe more should," Leonardo replied. Then, with genuine curiosity, "Tell me something about this course that only you would know." Henry's eyes lit up with the passion of a true artist discussing his life's work. "The 16th fairway," he said, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "Everyone aims for the center, but there's a subtle rise on the right side. Hit it there with a little draw, and you'll get an extra 30 yards of roll. Been that way since we rebuilt it in '89? Leonardo laughed. "Now you tell me, after I've already practiced playing it wrong." As they parted ways, heading to their respective starting holes, the gathered crowd witnessed something authentic, a moment of human connection that transcended celebrity and status. Phones captured it, social media spread it, and the narrative transformed completely. What had begun as an attempt at humiliation had become a story about respect, about earned place, about the true spirit of the game. Reed watched from the clubhouse steps, his professional smile firmly in place, but his eyes calculating the damage to his reputation. He'd lost more than control of the situation. He'd lost the authority of unquestioned exclusion. The invisible lines that had defined spaces like golden pines for generations had been challenged, not through grand gestures, but through one man's quiet dignity and another's willingness to stand beside him. By the third hole, videos of the morning's confrontation had spread across social media platforms. Let Henry Play was trending, alongside clips of Leonardo's intervention and Henry's quiet dignity. What had been intended as a private humiliation had transformed into a public conversation about access, about the unwritten rules of exclusion, about who belongs in spaces of privilege. Henry played with a grace that belied his years, his knowledge of the course evident in every shot, every putt. His vintage clubs sang in his weathered hands, connecting him to generations of golfers who had come before. When he sank a 20-foot putt on the fourth green, spontaneous applause broke out among the gathering spectators. Word spread quickly throughout the course. By the time Henry reached the ninth hole, the gallery following him had grown larger than those watching many of the celebrity players. People were drawn not just by the morning's drama, but by the genuine skill and quiet joy with which he played the course he had tended for decades. Reed maintained his professional composure throughout, but the damage was done. Club members whispered among themselves, some embarrassed by the public relations disaster, others reconsidering long-held assumptions about who belonged on their fairways. The invisible wall between those who maintained the course and those who played it had been irreparably cracked. As promised, Leonardo joined Henry's gallery on the back nine, watching with genuine appreciation as the groundskeeper navigated the course with the intimate knowledge of someone who had shaped its very contours. Between holes, Henry shared stories about the course's evolution, pointing out subtle features invisible to casual players. Leonardo listened intently, occasionally sharing these insights with other players and spectators who had joined them. The unexpected pairing drew media attention beyond social platforms. By afternoon, sports networks had picked up the story, framing it as a moment of genuine sportsmanship and inclusion. Commentators praised Leonardo's intervention, while celebrating Henry's lifetime of quiet expertise finally receiving recognition. When Henry approached the iconic 18th green, the gallery had swelled to hundreds. He stood for a moment, taking in the scene. The manicured perfection he had maintained for decades now stretched before him as a player rather than a caretaker. His shot from the fairway landed softly, rolling to stop 12 feet from the pin. The crowd erupted in applause. Leonardo stood at the edge of the green, watching as Henry surveyed the breaking putt with the concentration of someone who had read the same green thousands of times from the other side of the ropes. The entire gallery fell silent as Henry took his stance, his grandfather's putter balanced delicately in his calloused hands. The putt rolled true, tracking perfectly along the line Henry had read. As it dropped into the cup, the gallery erupted. Henry stood for a moment, absorbing a different kind of appreciation than he'd ever known on these grounds. Not the invisible gratitude for perfect playing conditions, but the direct acknowledgement of skill, of belonging, of rightful place. Leonardo approached, offering a handshake that turned into a spontaneous hug captured by dozens of cameras. That, he said with genuine admiration, was a masterclass in golf and grace. In the clubhouse afterward, Henry was welcomed into spaces that had been implicitly off-limits throughout his career. Players sought his insights, his stories. The vintage clubs that had initially drawn scorn became objects of admiration, connecting modern players to the game's roots. Reed approached as the evening wound down, his professional mask firmly in place. "Mr. Fletcher," he said, extending his hand, "the club would like to invite you to become an honorary member." Henry regarded him steadily, then shook the offered hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "but I've already earned my place here." As Henry Fletcher left Golden Pines that evening, carrying his grandfather's clubs over his shoulder, he walked not as an outsider granted temporary access, but as someone who had claimed his rightful place through skill, dignity, and a lifetime of quiet excellence. Behind him, the conversation he had sparked about merit versus privilege, about who truly belongs, continued among players, members, and the millions who had witnessed his story unfold through screens large and small across the world.